Alex Eala is different, and I do not mean that in the soft, careful way people usually mean it when they are trying to compliment someone, without saying anything specific.
I mean this in a way that actually unsettled me a little. It made me go back and watch the match again after it ended because I wasn't sure I had fully processed what I had just seen the first time. I've played against a lot of talented players in my career, but talented isn't the word I'm reaching for here. The word that keeps coming back to me is something closer to unfamiliar. And since watching her compete, I've been asking myself whether the rest of women's tennis has truly understood what they're looking at yet, or whether they're still trying to describe something new using language built for a completely different kind of player. I want to start with something honest about my own career, because I think it explains why this affected me the way it did. My path in this sport hasn't been straightforward. I won a Grand Slam as a qualifier, which still sounds strange to say even now. And the years since have been a slow, sometimes uncomfortable education in what it really takes to stay at the top once the shock of breaking through has worn off. I've learned the hard parts: pressure, expectation, and the gap between one extraordinary run and the long, repetitive reality of building something that lasts. So when I say that watching Alex Eala made me feel something unfamiliar, I say it as someone who understands the difference between a player having a moment and a player building something deeper. What struck me first wasn't even the result of the match. Honestly, the result is the least interesting part of it. What stayed with me was a specific moment, when everything started to turn against her. I've been in that situation more times than I can count. The rhythm that was working suddenly disappears. The opponent finds another level you didn't see coming. The crowd shifts with it, the energy changes, the air feels heavier, less forgiving. Most players, even very good ones, contract in that moment. Something tightens. The shots become safer. The body language shrinks slightly. Not because of weakness, but because the nervous system reacts honestly to pressure. That's just how competition works. But what I saw from Alexia in that exact moment was the opposite of contraction. She didn't get smaller. She expanded. I don't have a cleaner way to say it. She didn't retreat into herself under pressure, she created more space inside it. And the tennis that came out of that space didn't look like survival. It looked like control. There was a flicker of something I can only describe as recognition mixed with a kind of quiet discomfort. Because the version of myself that broke through at 18, the version that won that tournament as an unseeded qualifier and briefly felt like anything was possible, never quite had that specific quality I just described. I had bravery. I had a kind of fearless shot-making that came from not yet knowing enough about the sport to be afraid in the way more experienced players are afraid. There's a purity to that stage of a career. You play the moment without fully understanding what the moment costs. But what I saw from Alexia wasn't that kind of fearlessness. It wasn't ignorance. It was something more complete. It was the composure of someone who fully understands the stakes, and has built something strong enough inside herself to hold that understanding without being consumed by it. And those are not the same thing. The first is rare, but temporary. It belongs to the early part of a career, before experience teaches you what everything actually means. It fades the moment the stakes become real in a way you can no longer avoid. The second is rarer. And it is durable. Because it is not built on not knowing. It is built on knowing everything, and still choosing to expand instead of contract. I think about the path that brought her here, and I think about the path that brought me here, and the contrast between those two journeys is part of why this has stayed with me. My rise was sudden in a way the sport wasn't entirely prepared for, and I wasn't entirely prepared for either. It happened across a couple of weeks in front of a home crowd, with momentum building so quickly there was barely time to understand it before it had already taken on a life of its own. Alexia's path has been different. Longer. More gradual. Built through junior success that transitioned into a steady professional climb, rather than a single explosive breakthrough that redefined everything at once. And I used to believe, somewhere in the instinctive, competitive part of my mind, that the sudden version was more remarkable. More cinematic. More deserving of attention. Watching her has made me question that. Because what I'm seeing now is a player who has had the time to build a foundation beneath the talent, instead of letting the talent arrive before the foundation was fully formed. And I know better than almost anyone what that foundation means when the noise fades, when the attention settles, and all that's left is you, the racket, and the long, uncompromising reality of a career. There's a specific moment from that match I keep replaying. And it isn't even a highlight in the traditional sense. It's something smaller. Almost invisible to anyone not really watching. But it says everything. Nothing to do with a winner. Nothing to do with a particular shot. It was a single exhale. Alexia Eala had just lost a long, physical point, one she probably should have won. The kind of point where the quality of tennis outweighs the outcome. The kind that leaves a small mark, even if it doesn't show on the outside. Not dramatic, not visible, but still there. And in the space between that point and the next, I saw her do something that stayed with me. She closed her eyes. Just for a fraction of a second. And she exhaled fully. Not sharply. Not emotionally. Just, completely. Then she walked back to the baseline and hit an ace. Not a lucky ace. Not a free point. A placed, intentional, controlled serve that landed exactly where it needed to land, at exactly the moment it was needed most. I've thought about that half second more than almost anything else from the entire match. Because that half second is where matches are actually decided. Not in the rally that ends the point, but in the internal moment that follows it. It is the difference between players who become great and players who stay merely very good. Because it is not the ace that matters here. It is what happened in the space before it. That closed-eye exhale. That reset. That ability to take a disappointing outcome and stop it from spreading forward into the next point. Most players don't lose because of one bad point. They lose because that point leaks. It becomes tension. It becomes hesitation. It becomes residue that quietly contaminates everything that follows. What I saw from her was the opposite of that. A clean break. And I want to be honest about something the tennis world doesn't talk about enough, the cost of arriving in the spotlight before you've built the internal architecture to survive what the spotlight does to your mind. I lived that cost. After my run, I spent a long stretch of my career dealing with things that had very little to do with tennis itself, and everything to do with the weight of expectation arriving faster than I had the tools to process it. The game didn't change first. I did. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I've made peace with that period. In some ways, I'm grateful for it now, even if I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone in real time. But it gives me something very specific. A reference point. An understanding of what it looks like when a young player is walking through that same territory while still building themselves in public. And what stands out to me is that Alexia is not just surviving that space. She's navigating it with a kind of clarity that I didn't have at that stage. You can see it in small things. In how she speaks in press conferences. In how she carries herself between points. In how she talks about pressure, not as something she avoids, but as something she processes. And most importantly, in how nothing seems to carry over. Losses without collapsing into excessive self-criticism. And without drifting into hollow positivity either. There is a kind of balance there that is rare. The sense that her relationship with her own tennis is more stable than the public's relationship with her results. Because if that foundation isn't there, the volatility of external opinion eventually becomes internal volatility too. And once that happens, it becomes very difficult to separate who you are from what a scoreboard says about you on a given day. What also stands out in her game, and I want to be precise here, because I think precision matters more than enthusiasm when you're trying to describe something real, is the way she layers aggression and patience inside the same point without either one weakening the other. Most naturally aggressive players struggle with patience. Because patience can feel, to an aggressive instinct, like a compromise. Like a softening of identity. Like you're stepping away from what makes your game dangerous in the first place. And most naturally patient players struggle with the opposite problem. Accessing aggression at the exact moment when patience has already done its work and the point is ready to be finished. Because patience, when it becomes identity rather than tool, can turn into hesitation. And hesitation, at the highest level, is usually enough. But Alexia doesn't seem to experience that internal conflict in the same way. She builds the point with patience, reading, constructing, shifting angles, waiting for something real to appear rather than forcing something that isn't there. And then, when the opening finally arrives, she finishes the point with a level of conviction and clarity that suggests the patience was never passive to begin with. It was active. It was preparing. It was waiting in a way that already contained the decision. That is an unusually mature way to construct tennis at any age. At her age, seeing it consistently across a full match forces you to recalibrate what you think you're watching in real time. Because it stops feeling like potential. And starts feeling like structure. I think about what it would have meant for my own career if I had come up against someone playing like this when I was first breaking through. Because there is a level of recognition that exists between players that the public never fully sees. A private acknowledgement of category. Of who is genuinely different. And who is simply having a good run. I've had that feeling from the other side of the net more times than I'd like to admit. That moment when you realize the match is not going to be decided by effort alone, because the level across from you is not behaving like the ranking suggests it should. It changes how you breathe inside the match, even if you never say it out loud. Watching Alexia from a distance, as a fellow professional, not an opponent, I felt a version of that same recognition. Not fear. I'm not in a position where I'm preparing to compete against her. But something adjacent to it. A quiet, almost involuntary acknowledgement that what I was watching belonged in a category above where the current conversation around her seems to be. And I've been thinking a lot about why that conversation hasn't caught up yet. Because what she is doing doesn't always announce itself in the way people expect greatness to announce itself. It doesn't demand attention in the obvious moments. It reveals itself in the structure underneath them. And I think part of the answer is timing. The current landscape of women's tennis is crowded with genuinely excellent young talent. And when multiple compelling stories are developing at the same time, attention doesn't distribute itself evenly, it distributes itself unpredictably. And that distribution doesn't always reflect which story is actually the most significant. Alexia's development has been unfolding alongside several other narratives that, for a range of reasons, including marketing infrastructure, home tour visibility, and which tournaments receive the most broadcast focus, have naturally absorbed more of the wider conversation than her results alone would suggest. That isn't a criticism of anyone. It's just a description of how attention works in a crowded field. But it does create something very specific. It creates a gap between actual level and perceived level. And in my experience, that gap is rarely stable. It usually closes suddenly. And often dramatically. Because at some point, a result arrives that is large enough, visible enough, or undeniable enough to force the conversation to catch up all at once. And the day that happens, and I genuinely believe it is closer than most people currently assume, it won't feel like a gradual correction. It will feel like an awakening. For the people who were paying attention early, it will feel like confirmation of something they already understood. And for everyone else, it will feel like surprise. Or even disbelief. I've seen that exact pattern before in this sport. There is almost always a period where a player's actual level has already moved ahead of their public recognition. And during that period, they exist in a kind of competitive quiet, where the people playing against them already understand what they are dealing with. But the wider conversation does not. And then one result breaks that quiet. One tournament, one match, one moment that carries enough visibility to reset the narrative. And suddenly, everything that was already true starts being discussed as if it has just become true. I think Alexia is in that quiet right now. And I don't think she stays there for long. What I want to say to her directly, if she ever hears this, is something I wish someone had been able to say to me with this level of clarity before my own version of that spotlight arrived. The recognition that is coming for you will change the texture of your daily life in ways that are difficult to fully prepare for in advance. No matter how much you think you've anticipated it. The scrutiny becomes heavier. The expectations attach themselves faster than you expect. And they do so with a kind of momentum that can feel disorienting even when the results are there to justify it. People who have never said your name before will suddenly have strong opinions about you. And not all of them will be fair. Very few of them will be fully informed. And almost none of them will reflect who you actually are, or what you are actually building. What I learned eventually, after years of adjusting to that shift the hard way, is that you cannot build your identity inside that external noise. Because the noise will always change shape. It will rise. It will fall. It will contradict itself. And if your sense of self moves with it, you will never stay still long enough to build anything lasting. So the only real solution is to stay anchored somewhere else entirely. Not in results. Not in reaction. But in the structure of your own work. And from what I've seen, she already understands that in a way that most players only learn after they've been forced to lose it first. And honestly, the thing I keep returning to, the thing that stays with me long after the match is over, is how early this clarity seems to have arrived for her. Because that understanding, the one about where attention comes from, and what it does, and what it tries to take from you, is usually not something players arrive at with composure. It's something they arrive at through friction. Through losing it first. Through learning, often publicly, what it feels like when the external world starts to reshape your internal one. And yet what I see, at least from the outside, is someone who already behaves as if that lesson is not theoretical. As if it has already been accounted for. And that is rare. So when I step back from the match itself, and from the individual moments that stand out, the exhale, the reset, the way pressure seems to clarify rather than distort her game, I find myself thinking less about what she did in that particular match, and more about what kind of career those qualities usually lead to when they are sustained over time. Because in tennis, talent is not the differentiator at this level. It never really has been. What separates careers is stability under distortion.